Okay, so here you see a map of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. The French divided Indochina into these territories. You had Laos, Cambodia, and then Vietnam was divided into three separate chunks. Cochin China, centered around the city of Saigon, Annam, which was a large central region with its famous ancient citadel of Hue, and Tonkin, which is in the north near China, and it's centered around Hanoi. The Red River would be right here, and the Mekong River runs down through this region into Cochin China. And the Vietnamese saw this as an intentional attempt by the French imperial authorities to divide them and undermine their national unity. Now, why do the French do this? The three-part reasons are quite simple. Resources, colonial territories need to provide resources for the mother country. So this is a profit-centered sort of enterprise. Competition with other imperial powers. France had no colonies at the time in Southeast Asia or Asia in general. And they, of course, were flanked by the British territories in Burma, in India, in what is today Bangladesh, as well as the Dutch East Indies, the Spanish Philippines, which by the turn of the 20th century became the United States Philippines territory. And of course, China to the north wasn't colonized, though it was very much imperialized by European powers. The Qing dynasty was during the 1800s, following events like the Opium Wars. So resources, imperial competition. If you wanted to be a great power at this time, you needed to have territories. Territories to not only take resources, but to base your army, to port your navy. You needed to have a base whereby you could sort of access and influence other parts of the region and to compete geopolitically with other world powers. And then, of course, also religion. Religion in this case would be associated more broadly with Catholicism, the Jesuits, and also more broadly the white man's burden. So the French go to Vietnam and they justify it out of the pursuit of resources like rubber, which Michelin rubber will get huge contracts in Vietnam. Rubber, rice, metals like tin, tungsten, coal are all extracted from Vietnam. Competition with major other world colonial powers like the British in the region. And then the so-called white man's burden, or the civilizing mission, the idea that the French were bringing the highest, what they believed to be the highest level of civilization to Vietnam, that the developing world, that these individuals were effectively inferior and they had to have civilization brought to them, and this included Catholicism as what they believed to be the foremost religion of the world, French education, French language, French mannerisms in law, or French methods of law, and so forth, brought to Vietnam. So this is justified by the racist, civilizing mission that is sometimes called the white man's burden. Here you see artistic depictions of the early colonial enterprises of the French in Vietnam. Vietnam is an incredibly diverse geographical region. It has high mountains. It has desert. Well, not desert really, but it has high mountains. It has areas that are perhaps more arid and barren than other areas. It has huge, huge swaths of jungle. It has river delta regions. It has highlands and so forth. It has a wide array of sort of environmental and geographic conditions. In 1862, the French would take Saigon. There are Vietnamese fighters. Vietnamese people are deeply nationalistic. Vietnamese nationalism is basically a couple thousand years old, and Vietnamese nationalism is formed to a large degree around the Vietnamese resistance to the Chinese, both the Mongols as well as the Ming and Qing dynasty, as China in the north was always trying to effectively imperialize and control Vietnam. And the Vietnamese see themselves as a very unique national identity, and they resisted greatly the imperialism of the Chinese, and they formed their nationalism around there. So they were very staunchly nationalistic, and they would fight the influence of outsiders very, very rigorously with guerrilla warfare and so forth. So early on, you see partisan fighters fighting against the French, but ultimately the French will control Vietnam, and they will, and I'll show you some, these are rather graphic images, but the French control Vietnam with a great deal of force early on. They rule directly. They force the people of Vietnam to assimilate, to learn French, to be educated in French language, to potentially adopt Catholicism. And dissenters were crushed brutally. And imperialism is generally quite brutal. But those resisting French imperial rule were crushed in very, very harsh and brutal ways. This, what you're looking at here, is actually a postcard of decapitated heads of resistors in colonial Vietnam. And soldiers would have sent images like this, some cases, back home. Maybe they would have sent them back home to their sweethearts in Paris. With love, if you will, from colonial Vietnam, as they were demonstrating their powerful repression of resistors in Vietnam. Of course, the result of this is Vietnamese nationalism. The Vietnamese were deeply nationalistic, and they would resist this. And so in the short term, you might find this brutal repression by the French. You might find this crushing dissent in the short term. But it's really kind of like schools for future Vietnamese resistance, as individuals like Ho Chi Minh, who became the figure who famously fought against the French and the Americans in pursuit of an independent communist Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was born in 1890, and he grew up in this sort of repressive French imperial rule. And it only enhanced his passionate nationalistic drive to throw out outsiders and create an independent Vietnamese state. Another result in Vietnam is a French-educated and Catholic ruling class. So there's a great deal of French spoken language, French education, and the well-off people in Vietnam are now converting to Catholicism. So Vietnamese culture like reels in this moment of time, as you have the ruling classes increasingly having to adapt to French education, French religion, in order to establish themselves as the ruling class in Vietnam. And the French will use those sort of upper class aristocrats in Vietnam basically to become intermediaries through which they rule. Nonetheless, after the French take Saigon in 1862 by force, by the 1890s, Indochina, the French called this area Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was really in the economic red, if you will. It was losing money. It was losing money. It was not providing the profits to the mother country. It was really a financial sinkhole. And while there were companies that were profiting, by and large, it was costing the French a tremendous amount of money. They were losing lots of money in the process of doing this. And as a result of that, they brought in an individual named Paul Dumé. Paul Dumé became the Governor General of Indochina. And Paul Dumé was kind of like a money person. He was a person that was going there with the purpose of effectively turning Vietnam and Indochina into a profitable colonial enterprise for not only companies but also the French government. How would he do this? Well, you can imagine, given what we know already about imperialism and colonialism, that it will be very brutal and harsh for the people of Vietnam. First of all, the whole notion of some high-minded civilizing mission is really not meaningful to Dumé. This is propaganda, it's justification, it's a way to sell it back home in France, but ultimately his own goal was to make Vietnam a profitable thing. And so while he is, of course, These individuals are very racist in their thinking. He's not meaningfully trying to promote a civilizing mission. He is treating the Vietnamese people as inferior individuals whose only purpose is to make Vietnam profitable for the mother country. How will he do this? He will do this by making the Vietnamese effective servants. The rice that they grow will be grown for export, and you will meet certain high quotas, even if peasants starve. And starvation became not an uncommon phenomenon during the worst times in French Indochina. Taxes. Well, taxes can't be paid by French corporations because they need to be profitable. So taxes, the burden of taxes are put onto the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese are not only being treated as effective a servant class who might starve, they're also being put really with the burden of taxation for supporting the French colony. Monopolies, such as Michelin Rubber, are given huge power over resources of rubber, of coal, and so you grant blanket monopolies to these large entities like Michelin Rubber, and the monopolistic plantations, like the rubber plantations, are going to be naturally established on sacred lands. The Vietnamese people, they practice, like many Asian cultures, ancestor veneration. These people have been working on the same land for generations. Their parents worked there, their grandparents worked there, their grandparents worked that land, and this is very much an ingrained cultural thing of venerating your ancestors and lifting up your ancestors after they've passed. Well, now you have huge monopolies controlling the land, displacing populations, establishing monopolies that do not benefit the Vietnamese people. During 1917 and 1944, nearly a third of the workforce died on the rubber plantations. Many of the Vietnamese laborers believed that they were intentionally being worked to death to be used as fertilizer for the rubber trees. It was incredibly brutal. Peasants lose land, and their situation becomes that much more desperate. When that wasn't enough to make Vietnam, Indochina a profitable enterprise, the French even, like as we saw with China and the Opium Wars, the French even went the route of falling in league with organized crime and promoting the sale and profit from opium. Now, opium is a highly addictive drug. Of course, today it's used in many, many painkillers. During this period of time, opium was typically smoked, and it's extremely addictive, and it tends to make a person tired. It's a painkiller, so people tend to go into opium dens, which were these like areas where people went in, they paid for their opium, they smoked it, and they effectively just zonked out, if you will, and slept and relaxed in opium dens. It was regarded for governments in China, as well as indigenous governments in Vietnam, it was regarded as something that really hurt society. People stopped being productive. They became basically a drag on society in the opium dens. In China, we saw with the Opium Wars, you had a case where the Chinese, under the Qing dynasty, China has a very, very ancient sort of culture and legacy, and they did not have a great appetite for Western European manufactured goods, regardless of what they were necessarily. And so, with the case, for example, the British, the Europeans wanted to buy lots of stuff from China, but China did not want to buy as much stuff from them. So the problem is you had all of this money pouring into China. There was effectively a trade deficit where the British in China were buying more and more and more goods, but the same was not reciprocal. And so it was a trade deficit. As a result of that, the British forced the doors of China open in the middle of the 1800s in an event known as the Opium Wars, where they effectively forced the government of China to allow them, the British, to effectively sell and trade in opium, which allowed them to profit from their imperial activities in China. A similar thing happens in Vietnam. The French fall in line with a group, a gang basically, known as the Ben Xuyen, And the Ben Zuen, they controlled illegal gambling, prostitution, and also the drug trade. And effectively, the French said, look, as long as they get a cut of it, as long as the French imperial government got a cut of it, they would basically sanction the Ben Zuen and take a cut from the profits of the drug trade from the Ben Zuen. A third of Indochina's income was drawn from the sale of things like opium. And so we can see how just tumultuous this event is for the Vietnamese people, how tumultuous French colonialism is to them, and why it sowed the seeds eventually for the Vietnam War, first the French Indochina War, and then the Vietnam War, in which the Vietnamese people led by Ho Chi Minh would fight against the United States. And while the United States was fighting in the interest of preventing communism in the Cold War, the Vietnamese would see them as really no different than any other imperial outsider, whether the Chinese or whether the French